He stepped outside, expecting a normal day, until he saw the car in his spot. Anger flared as he noticed the HOA permit on the windshield. But that wasn't the worst part. What he uncovered next shook him to the core. The truth they'd been hiding could ruin everything. But what happened next? No one saw that coming. Let's start from the beginning. Ben Turner had always taken pride in his suburban townhouse. For over 5 years, it had been his sanctuary, a place where the chaos of the world outside felt miles away. The quiet street, the neatly manicured lawns, the routine of daily life, all of it gave him a sense of calm. But his small, private parking spot, the one right next to his front door, was the highlight. It wasn't just practical, it was his. A small slice of territory that belonged to him alone. It was a small thing, but it mattered. Then one morning, everything shifted. As Ben stepped outside, the familiar sight of his parking space should have been there, waiting for him. But instead, there was a car. A stranger's car, sitting right where he usually parked. His stomach dropped. At first, he thought it might be an honest mistake, maybe a new neighbor who wasn't familiar with the rules. But as he walked down the row of parking spaces, his worst fear became clear. This wasn't a mistake. The car wasn't just any car. It had an HOA-issued parking permit plastered across the windshield. Ben's blood ran cold. They'd given his spot away, his private, reserved space, something he'd paid for, something he'd earned, had been taken without a single word of warning. No notice, no apology, nothing. He stood there, staring at the car, seething. The worst part wasn't the car, though. It was the woman sitting inside it, completely oblivious to the storm brewing outside. She didn't even look up as he approached. She was probably thinking it was just another normal day, oblivious to the fact that she was parked in someone else's spot, in his spot. Ben's anger surged. This wasn't just about the spot. This was about respect. It was about the HOA overstepping its bounds and taking something that wasn't theirs, something that meant something to him. And now, it was just gone. For the next few days, Ben's life became consumed by frustration. Every time he tried to contact the HOA office, it felt like he was fighting an invisible enemy. The phone calls went unanswered or subjected him to long, agonizing holds, where the automated voice repeated its hollow message. "All our representatives are currently busy." His emails were met with silence, and when he did manage to speak with someone, they dismissed his concerns without a second thought, offering him nothing but vague explanations and empty promises. "The new arrangement is for community needs," they said, as though that explained everything. "There's nothing we can do about it," they claimed, as if the rules no longer applied. The more they spoke, the more they seemed to brush him aside, treating his issue like it was inconsequential. But to Ben, this wasn't just about a parking space. It was about respect, about his rights being trampled on. Feeling powerless, Ben took matters into his own hands. Late into the night, he buried himself in the HOA's governing documents. He sifted through pages of legal jargon, clauses, and provisions. The more he read, the more it felt like a maze of rules meant to protect the HOA's interests and ignore those of the residents. But then, amidst the convoluted mess, one clause stood out. Homeowners, according to the policy, were entitled to retain their designated parking spots unless they explicitly agreed to a change. The HOA had violated this rule. They had no right to assign his spot to someone else without his consent. His heart pounded as he read it again, and then again. His anger, which had been simmering beneath the surface, flared into something sharper. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a legal violation. The HOA had overstepped its bounds, and they hadn't even had the decency to inform him. Ben was no longer just angry. He was determined. The feeling of helplessness that had gnawed at him for days was replaced with a growing sense of resolve. He wasn't going to let them get away with this. This was personal now, and he would fight for what was rightfully his. Armed with the legal knowledge he had painstakingly uncovered, Ben walked into the HOA office with a sense of purpose. No longer was he the frustrated homeowner hoping for a resolution. He was a man on a mission, ready to make them face the consequences of their actions. He demanded an immediate meeting with the board. At first, they balked, insisting they were too busy or dismissing his request outright. But Ben wasn't about to be brushed off again. He had spent days digging through their rules, and he wasn't leaving until they listened. After some resistance, the board grudgingly agreed. When the meeting finally began, Ben didn't waste time. He laid out his case with precision, pointing directly to the clause in the HOA's own documents that they had violated. The board's initial expressions of annoyance slowly morphed into shock as they realized Ben had caught them red-handed. His voice was steady but firm as he highlighted their oversight, showing them exactly how they had broken the rules. There was a palpable shift in the room. The board, once confident and dismissive, now seemed uncertain. They began to murmur among themselves, trying to downplay the situation. "It's not a big deal," one of them muttered, clearly hoping to sweep it under the rug. But Ben wasn't having it. His voice grew sharper as he refused to let them trivialize his personal inconvenience. He had spent too much time feeling helpless, too many hours trying to get through to them. This wasn't just about a parking spot anymore. It was about accountability. In a moment of sharp clarity, Ben made his move. "If you don't resolve this," he said, his tone cold, "I'll have no choice but to take legal action. You know the fines you'll face if this goes to court." The room went silent. The smugness that had marked the board's behavior was replaced with uncomfortable shifting in their seats. They hadn't expected this. Ben could see it in their faces. Now they realized they might have more to lose than they had ever anticipated. And for the first time since this nightmare had begun, Ben knew he had the upper hand. A week later, Ben opened his mailbox to find an envelope from the HOA. His heart skipped a beat as he tore it open, expecting more bureaucracy, more excuses. Instead, he found a letter offering compensation for the inconvenience. Not only that, but they had issued a formal apology and, most importantly, had agreed to revert the parking assignment back to him. At first, Ben could hardly believe it. The HOA, the same organization that had dismissed him at every turn, was now acknowledging their mistake. They had been forced to backtrack. His mind flashed to the countless hours he had spent chasing answers, dealing with rude representatives, and poring over legal jargon to build his case. Now, it was all paying off. But for Ben, this wasn't just about getting his parking spot back. It was about principle. It was about standing up for his rights when they had been trampled on by an arrogant bureaucracy. By holding his ground, he had exposed a flaw in the HOA's system, one that they would now have to correct. This victory wasn't just personal. It was a statement. He had made them pay for their oversight, forcing them to admit their fault. As Ben pulled into his driveway, the familiar sight of his parking spot, now officially his again, filled him with a sense of calm. He parked in his spot, taking a moment to breathe it in. It wasn't just a victory for a small, everyday issue. It was a reminder of what persistence, knowledge, and a refusal to back down could accomplish. Justice had been served, and not only had he regained control of his space, but he had also ensured that the HOA would think twice before messing with his property again. He couldn't help but smile to himself as he sat in his car for a moment, reflecting on the journey. All it had taken was a little knowledge, some careful planning, and the will to fight for what was right. And in the end, that was all that mattered.